It's certainly good to be with you this morning. We know quite a few of the people here from other places, other times, and it's always good to be reunited, and singing was absolutely amazing. I know that doesn't happen by accident. I appreciate the good leading and training that you've had, and boy, that's great worship. Inspiring. I'd like to talk to you about some of the evidence that we are required to give from time to time for our faith that is available from archaeology. Talking this morning about the evidence from the New Testament. In 1 Peter chapter 3, Peter says, "Sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you." I believe our faith in Christianity is unique among the religions of the world, even in the approach. Others don't think this way. Just believe it because we say so. The denominational world today, it's all over the place. A defense for faith, reasons for why we should believe something first they can't do very well, and they don't try. But we're commanded to, and sometimes even with all the evidence we have, we don't do as good a job as we should, and we are commanded to be ready, and the elders have arranged this so that you can be more prepared to do that. Make a defense. And I'm having a hard time with my computer this morning, and I'm not sure why it's not behaving itself. But let me back up and try one more thing. And I was telling some of them earlier, we had to get here in time to solve some of these problems. That I was a firm believer that Murphy was an optimist. I want to begin with some evidence that is several years old, early part of the 2000s, but certainly not going back that far, and has been the object of a great deal of controversy, but I think is extremely significant. This is a picture of the front page of Biblical Archeology Review, and it's a picture of a bone box called an ossuary, and the inscription across the center is the really significant part. Bone boxes, ossuaries, were used uniquely by the Jews in the first century. It's a burial technique that is different from any other time in their history, and so when you find that, you know when this occurred. They would put the body on a shelf in the tombs and let it sit there for about a year, and then come back and collect the bones and put them in a box like this called an ossuary. It's about as long as the longest bone in the body, usually about 20 inches. And this is, as Bar Biblical Archaeology Review says, written evidence in stone of Jesus, of James, and of course the Father. It is of breathtaking significance according to Biblical Archaeology, and they're all over the place as far as their position, liberal, conservative. They let everybody talk. But this was the editor. He said it's the most important find in the history of New Testament archaeology. And so I think he's right. That's where I want to begin this morning. We've got a lot of ground to cover. We'll try to move quickly. But that's part of the point. There's a lot of information. So if I get through quick, then I won't have done my job. Well, I'm warning you. This is a picture of that inscription that you can barely see, and it says, James, the son of Joseph, the brother of Jesus. And there's not really there's no question about what it does say, but whether or not this comes from the first century, of course, they have to. And why would they argue about this? Well, first, it provides faith for what the New Testament says, and that embarrasses the liberals that say this was all mythological. It embarrasses the Catholics for their Mariology, that she was a perpetual virgin and she never had any other children, and then became the mediatrix like Christ. And so it produces some pretty frantic efforts in order to mitigate its significance. James, the son of Joseph, the brother of Jesus, if that's what was in this box, then there's a lot of people who have to back up and start over. Jesus did have brothers, according to the New Testament. John 7, therefore his brother said to him, leave here and go to Judea. Not even his brothers were believing in him. So James started out as an unbeliever, and perhaps we see some of that significance when we see Jesus appearing first to James and then to all of the apostles. This is my brother. He didn't believe. I want him to know first. Galatians 2, James, together with Cephas and John, were pillars in the church. And you remember in Acts chapter 12, Peter was released from prison. He described to them how the Lord had led him out of prison and said, report these things to James and to the brethren. So he had become prominent among the brethren. And in Acts 15, we see when the controversy occurred there, finally James gave the verdict and the final decision. James answered, saying, brethren, listen to me. History records what happens. Secular history does. Sacred does not. But we get pretty reliable evidence from history. This is a 13th century mosaic from the Cathedral of San Marcos in Venice. It quotes and references Hegosippus' record written in 150 AD, which is not that far removed. I think Revelation was written 96 AD. Just a few years from some of the books of the New Testament. We don't have Hegosippus. All of those copies have disappeared, but this is quoted by Eusebius, as well as several other historians. Eusebius goes back to 316, and he said, James was thrown from the pinnacle of the temple. This is Eusebius quoting Hegosippus. When that did not kill him, he was stoned, and when that did not kill him, he was stove in by Fuller's club. And then we see that depicted here in the mosaic. Now, the pinnacle of the temple doesn't look like that much of a pinnacle today, but then you remember the Romans came in and messed things up and piled a lot of rubble and ruin, so that this corner is not as precipitous today as it was, though you can photograph it that way if you get it the right angle. But it was from this high point, not as high today, that he was thrown, and it did not completely kill him. And we back up to get a larger perspective. We see the Kidron Valley running down beside the Temple Mount, and across the Kidron Valley is an area called Silwan today, and that's a Palestinian area, but it was this area where a lot of tombs have been found, a number of artifacts, and it was in one of those tombs that this ossuary was found. So he's killed there at this precipice pinnacle of the temple and then buried just across the valley. Well, is this a real first century inscription and ossuary? One of the things that was initially examined, it was presented to the Geological Survey of Israel to look at the patina, which is something that geologists are experts on. It builds up, it's a bacterial deposit likely, over perhaps 1,000 years minimum. And that will give us some idea of its antiquity and whether or not this is certainly a recent carving. Down at the bottom of this statement from the Geological Survey of Israel, we read the patina does not contain any modern elements, such as modern pigments. It adheres firmly to the stone. No signs of the use of modern tool or instrument was found. No evidence that might detract from the authenticity of the patina and the inscription is found. It convinced a lot of scholars. Professor John Mackay, who is not a conservative scholar, we'll put it that way, author of the Archeology of the New Testament, a popular atlas. 6 different pieces of the patina stone were looked at through the laboratory. It was verified by people who are not Christians. That date on this first century, that is first century, and there's no evidence of recent disturbances of the box. Eric Myers, again, a liberal scholar, professor of Judaic Studies and director of the graduate program of religion at Duke University. I have no question that it is an ancient artifact from the first century. Well, that's pretty impressive when you see the liberal scholars accepting this. And how do you think that went over in Jerusalem? You can imagine how it would be in the Sanhedrin if they're confirming the resurrection of Christ. Well, they're not going to go along with that, are they? And so they began to fight back and claim beyond any doubt, in spite of the fact that the Israeli geological survey had pretty well confirmed it, that it was a fake. This is reported in the Dallas Morning News. Inscription tied to Jesus is a fake. Well, that wasn't accepted by many of the scholars, but what was the reason? Well, they didn't have to have a reason, but they came up with a lot. We need to understand the context, and we'll talk more about this evening when we look at archaeology from the Old Testament, that the dominant thinking in archaeology are a group called the minimalist. And these are typically atheists who are viciously opposed to anything that would prove the Bible. And of course, we've got a lot of that in the U.S. as well. And then there are the elitists who are too elite to accept anything found by a commoner. It has to be a part of a providence dig. It doesn't matter how important, how significant if it wasn't one of us, then we won't have anything to do with it. Of course, they're embarrassed by the Dead Sea Scrolls, almost all of which were found by the Bedouins. And then it's exacerbated by the Arab-Israeli conflict, where if anything confirms Israel's right to the land, the authenticity of Scripture, for example, that affects the Palestinians because they're claiming this is their land and the Jews never were there. Now, the Muslim scholars acknowledged and argued that they were there up until 87, and the fact they verified and authenticated the spot for the Dome of the Rock by the fact this is where Abraham was sacrificed Isaac. This was the original site of the temple, and then they realized, no, that's helping Israel, and so it's no longer, all of that's no longer true, and Israel was never there. This is the context that we're working in, and so you have to understand it against that background. There is a very strong, overwhelming case against the idea that it's a modern forgery. There's the linguistic evidence and the consensus of Aramaic experts. 17 of them were quoted in the trial that we'll mention in a moment. All but 2 confirmed. The 2 that didn't were not experts in anything that had to do with Israel. They were studying ancient English, Old English, and that really doesn't qualify them. 2 out of 17, though, are the only ones that disagreed. The paleographic evidence was absolutely unanimous. These are the ones that study the style of the ancient writings. All of the experts agreed that this was first century. The geological evidence we showed you from the geological survey regarding the patina, and then you could call it psychological evidence in reference to the thinking of the fellow who owned this thing. He'd had it for 15 years in his collection, didn't have any idea what it was about. A friend of his who was an expert happened to be there for an evening meal and saw it and said, wow, and brought it to his attention. And he was not trying to fool anybody or come up with anything. He'd had it sitting there for 15 years and said nothing about it. There's no profit motive. He wasn't trying to sell it. But he was charged with fraud, and it looked like he was going to jail for life. There was a 7-year trial in Israel over this. I said that right. 7 years to complete that trial. The government was determined to convict him, but all of the evidence kept crumbling, and the people who were initially trying to complain got converted and changed, or at least gave up. And finally, the verdict came down, and he was not guilty. Biblical Archeology Review said the forgery trial of the century is concluded in Jerusalem courtroom. Defendant has been acquitted of all major charges and of all recorded reference to Jesus of Nazareth. And you look at that and you say, wow, that's impressive in itself, from the Wall Street Journal. And there's just, I think, overwhelming evidence. Though you'll hear people say, well, it's been proved fraud. They tried, and they failed. When this appeared in the Dallas Morning News, they admitted, okay, yeah, this is real, it's valid. We know then there was James, the son of Joseph, the brother of Jesus, grating on them. But then they added, but this is the only archaeological evidence supporting faith in the New Testament. Well, that's probably the only thing this journalist knew, and of course they teach them all kinds of evidence in journalism school. They lie to him and tell him there's none, and that's what he believed. I want to assure you that's not even beginning to start to be close to the truth. For example, there's the tomb of Caiaphas that was found with another ossuary. Caiaphas would confirm the story. Of course, he's one of the high priests there involved with the trial of Christ. This has been in the museum there in Jerusalem on prominent display for years. That would be the kind of thing that he said didn't exist. This is more evidence. Out on the outskirts of Jerusalem, it was found back in 1990. They were building a road and unearthed some burial spots and found a burial plot for the family of Caiaphas, and his whole family was in there. The name was clearly identified on the end of the box, and it's a very ornate ossuary which would be appropriate for a person of his status. In addition, together with that, the ornate ossuary which would be appropriate for a person of his status. In addition, together with that, there was the granddaughter of Caiaphas that was clearly identified. She was documented from history and rather well known. And there's not been any objection. I mean, the name is on the box. It's together with the rest of the family. This all helps to verify. And then there's another ossuary that's been traveling with the Dead Sea Scrolls around the country. This was when it was in Houston, and we were able to attend. This is the son of Simon of Cyrene. You remember the story recorded in Scripture that he was compelled to help Jesus carry the cross. Alexander was his son. We look at Mark 15. They pressed into service a bypasser coming from the country of Simon of Cyrene. Simon Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to bear his cross. Some have suggested maybe they'd found Rufus' ossuary as well, but that's not as well established. But Archeology Review, I think, summarizes, when we consider how common the name Alexander was, that is, in Jerusalem, and note that the ossuary inscription lists him in the same relationship to Simon as the New Testament does, and recall that the burial cave contains remains of people from Cyrene. The chance that Simon on the ossuary refers to Simon of Cyrene mentioned in the Gospels seems very likely. I think that's an understatement, but I would agree with them. only evidence is the James ossuary. Well, if you're just looking at ossuaries, that's not even close to true. And there's lots of other evidence. Pilate is one of the more prominent people in the New Testament story. And there's lots of other evidence. Pilate is one of the more prominent people in the New Testament story. We read in Matthew 27, he saw that he was accomplishing nothing. He washed his hands, a story most of us remember. Now, the fact that there was such a man was attested historically by Josephus, first century historian, by Philo, Jewish philosopher, and by Tacitus, first century Roman historian. And we talked about the reliability of those documents, which nobody questions, even though they're hundreds of years removed from the original. But all of these verify. And then in 61, we found this rather tattered, broken piece, but it was a monument found at Caesarea Maritime, which is where Herod built a magnificent structure. It says Tiberius, and I'm superimposing the English letters here on the Roman. Tiberius Pontius Pilate, Perfect of Judea. It had been in a temple to honor Tiberius and taken out and reused as steps and then found in the ruins. And so nobody was trying to forge this, obviously, but there is written in stone the documentary evidence of Pilate. Matthew 2 describes Herod the king, that the Magi, wise men, came and talked to you, remember, arriving from the east. We see all kinds of evidence for Herod. Of course, there's no evidence but the ossuary. Herod has just abundant evidence. We often hear the story regarding him ridiculed. Matthew 2, he saw he'd been tricked by the wise man. That just doesn't ring true. Who's going to believe that? Anybody that knows Herod would believe it. But it is truly an awesome story. I mean, it makes us sick at our stomach to think about it. And even more so, perhaps, when we see the archaeological documentation found now called the Chapel of the Innocence under a church that was meant to commemorate this terrible tragedy, where they had buried thousands of 1 and 2 year old children. Now, why would you have just 1 and 2 year old children in a pile of bones? What would do that? Well, we've got a good answer for that in Matthew 2. He killed the children and buried them, and we found that proved, and I think that's fairly well accepted at this point. Herod was a megalomaniac. He restored the temple that had, of course, been restored and was responsible for the temple of Jesus' time. In the middle period between the Testaments, the Hasmoneans, and then Herod's temple went way out, and it was spectacular. It was just truly awesome. And he was a rival of Solomon in his own mind. He was going to try to outdo Solomon. And we have all kinds of descriptions of this, especially from Josephus, and this is mostly from his description. The Portico of Solomon was just a magnificent structure and described by a number of historians. But you see, there's no archaeological evidence. Well, we've got tons of it. Back up to Herod's palace in Caesarea Maritime, where the Pilate inscription was found. You can go, this, by the way, is the restoration by National Geographic. And it's a marvel of engineering. This was the first time that we find the very effective use of underwater concrete. They could build the foundations underwater, and they're still standing, many of them. And you can see where some of the pillars and the destructions that followed were thrown into the ocean, and you can see the pools surrounding it. You can see the aqueduct that was leading to it that goes for 30 miles that still can be used to bring water. But see, there's no archaeological evidence. It's just all over the place. How do you ignore that? He also built Masada, which was a place where a lot of Jews killed themselves. It's not a very proud moment in Jewish history, but it was a desert fortress overlooking the Red Sea. Killed themselves. It's not a very proud moment in Jewish history, but it was a desert fortress overlooking the Red Sea. And Herod built a mountain. I mean, true megalomaniac. Yeah, I want a mountain built to my honor. And using slave labor, the monument, of course, still stands. You can drive up there. You have a hard time getting a scale, but you see up in the top of it all kinds of fancy buildings. He did have a small synagogue just in deference to the Jews. Here's my beloved standing on the way up, looking down at the Playboy Palace at the bottom, could be described, the swimming pools and the columns. And in that pool, he drowned his father-in-law, several of his 10 wives, 2 of his sons. Nice fellow. In fact, Herod made the comment that he'd rather be Herod's pig than his son. You know, taking the jab at the Jews and Herod at the same time. Jews don't like the pigs, but he'd rather be a pig than the son of Herod. But he drowned all of these people in this. This all, of course, is saying, yeah, these objections to the story of killing the children don't really fit if you know Herod. Okay, I've got that quote here. I'd forgotten I'd put that in. From this, you can see the scale of the swimming pool area, the mountain in the background. There were steps, according to Josephus, that went up to the mountain. 200 steps of the purest marble, crowned with the circular towers at the top, according to Josephus. And many archaeologists had hunted for that, but then finally it was found, announced in 2007. Ehud Netzer, that we'd worked with on several occasions, and then helped excavate this tomb of Herod that was there on the side of his mountain. After more than 30 years of hunting, he found that. Actually, it had been destroyed and broken, and then a church built on top of it, almost in defiance of this terrible person. But his sarcophagus was found in about 10,000 pieces there on the side of this mountain that he built for himself. And here is Ehud Netzer, who was killed when the scaffolding collapsed in 2010 that I had been walking on about 6 months earlier. A very ornate, elaborate sarcophagus of Herod, a very significant character, and here is in stone the evidence, crumbled and beaten to indicate the attitude of the people toward him. In fact, he had issued a decree that when he died, he had a list of 300 of the leading Jewish aristocrats that would be killed the same day he died. Well, he was dead, and so they ignored it. But that tells you the kind, he wanted somebody to cry when he died, and so killed the aristocrats, and I think they laughed when he died. His grandson was Herod Agrippa I. You remember in Acts chapter 12, he appeared in the royal apparel, took his seat on the rostrum. He was certainly a great aristocrat. People cried out, "The voice of a God, not of a man." And you Bible students know exactly what happened to him. It wasn't a very glorious death. It was Josephus says it took him at least 3 days to die. Certainly miserable. But Here's a coin with his image on it. And he kind of looks like he's being eaten, doesn't he? Sour look on his face. The great-grandson was Herod Agrippa II. And remember that Paul made his appeal before him. Acts 25. Several days had elapsed. King Agrippa, Bernice arrived in Caesarea. We have all kinds of coins with his image on it. And you recall in Acts 22, Jesus held up the coin. We've got one of them in our museum back here. Whose image is this? They said, Caesar's. Well, who is he talking about? He's talking about the Emperor Tiberius. That's the only denarius with the emperor's image that existed at that time. And the one we've got looks almost this good. In Acts 13, and we're just kind of going through Acts at this point, and I'm being selfish to talk about some of the things I have some connection with typically. I like to talk about
O Lord our God,
that we're not getting to. In Acts 17, we read about the proconsul, Sergius Pilate. He was of Caiaphas, and the proconsul believed. All right, here in Cyprus is this prominent city, Caiaphas, and it has a proconsul. Well, what in the world is a proconsul? The skeptics for years said there's no such thing, and then they found several inscriptions. And just outside of this city of Caiaphas, they found this stone, and superimposing the English letters on the Latin, this is Paulus Proconsul. It refers to the proconsul of Caiaphas and refers to him as a proconsul and identifies him. Now, he left, according to history, Cyprus and went back to Rome, and about 10 years after this was found, another one was found near Rome, almost exactly the same, referring to the same person. Again, more archaeological evidence confirming the New Testament. Moving from Cyprus over to Corinth. Romans, of course, written from Corinth, tells us in verse 23 that Gaius was the host, and the whole church greets you. Erastus, the city treasurer, greets you. And several of the skeptics had ridiculed the idea that Christians had converted the treasurer of the city. And then we found the pavement stone with his name on it among the ruins there at Corinth. Erastus, in return for aedileship, that's a fancy word for the treasury, the office of treasury, at his own expense, and then it stops, but we can tell what it's saying. He has done this at his own expense. He is the treasurer there in Corinth. Josephus also describes him at length, describes him as a man of great dignity. There in the church at Rome, giving greetings. In Acts 18, we read, while Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, Achaia would include the area Corinth, and he was there when the Jews rose up against Paul and brought Paul before the judgment seat. And that's a word that sent shivers up and down the spines of the people in the first century. And we know where the judgment seat is there at Corinth against the Acropolis in the background. And right there where the little green arrow is, it says, this is the word for the judgment seat. You can see different scenes of that picture. That's where Paul was brought to the judgment seat. But Gallio, who was he? We found the judgment seat, but you didn't find Gallio. He's not a real person. Well, we had to go up to Delphi to find reference to him, and this is an inscription from AD 41 to 51 at Delphi, Greece, to Gallio, my friend and proconsul. And this was written by Emperor Claudius Caesar, AD 41, to Gallio, my friend. Well, we've got proconsul, the term verified, as well as Gallio, and the time from the emperor. We're reminded in Romans 14, we shall all stand before, here's the same word, the judgment. Paul was there before the judgment seat. That's where we're going to be, before the judgment seat of God. We move on to Acts 19, to Ephesus. And there we read of the crowd crying out, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." Paul was saying, nope, Diana is not worth anything. And they thought this was the most important thing about the city, and they got upset about that, which we can imagine. She was, I guess you call that great, considering attitudes of people today. Somebody with that many breasts would attract a lot of attention. Great is Diana of the Ephesians, and that image is on the pottery and on the coins. And there was a huge temple, and huge is hardly the word, that was built, and you really need something for scale in that picture. But the people are little bitty. Those are 60-foot columns. I'm standing beside a shortened one in the museum there at Istanbul. Give you a little bit of the size of the columns. It's in an area that is a swamp most of the time today, but we caught it at a drought taking this picture. And can you see me standing beside the column? Almost. I don't look very big. The column. Doesn't look so awesome today, does it? The main street of town, back end of it is still kind of swampy. The shoreline has moved considerably. It was at the end of the street before. But we read in Acts chapter 19, they rushed with one accord into the theater, dragging along Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia. Drug them right down that street, right there, into the theater. You can't see their heel marks there still, but you know that's where they went. And right into that huge theater that seats about 40,000 people. The ruins are scattered over the area, but it's still in pretty good shape. And that's where they shouted, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." And you see how I react when I hear it. This is this ossuary, the only archaeological evidence of the New Testament. That's just an insane statement if you have any knowledge at all. The people there, maybe Paul got to talk to them, I don't know. I tried to talk to them and it didn't do any good at all. But it was interesting to stand there and to think about those events. Going back in history to Luke 2, you remember the decree went out from Caesar Augustus that a census would be taken. There's been a lot of controversy about the census. And you read the text, you can tell there was a first, there was a second. They get the two confused, and guess how they do that. We do know what Caesar Augustus looked like. We've got good depictions of him. And verse 2 says this was the first census, while Quirinius was governor of Syria. Well, there never was somebody named Quirinius. Nobody ever heard of him until we got further documentation up in Antioch of Pisidia, where his name is mentioned as an official. But the real clincher, just mind-boggling, came from, of all places, Venice, Italy. Well, now, why would you find confirmation of what's going on in Palestine in Italy? Well, who was occupying Palestine at the time? The Roman soldiers all over the place, some of them from Venice. This is the inscription on a tombstone of a soldier that was from Venice that refers to Secundus, the name of the soldier, of the Palatine tribe. This is a rough translation. He was from he served in Palestine in the service of the divine Augustus. Okay, it was Augustus that required the census to be made. Under Quirinius in Syria. And so here's reference then to Syria, and referred to him conducting a census by the order of Quirinius. That's exactly what we read in Luke 2 on a tombstone found in an archaeological museum in Venice, Italy. Luke 2, Caesar Augustus made the census while Quirinius was the governor. All of it's right there on the tombstone. I think that's awesome. That's not made up. In Acts 11, we read about Agabus, who stood up and showed by the Spirit that there was going to be a great famine in all the world, and he did this in the days of Claudius Caesar. And there were a sequence of Roman emperors, all of whom are clearly identified in history and verified. This ill-clad fellow is Claudius Caesar. We've got a number of coins that verify him. Then following him is Nero, and most of us have heard of him. He was one of the most cruel men alive, but his persecution was primarily around Rome. And this is how Paul and likely Peter was in prison in Rome under Nero. This is where they were in prison. Now, the part of the building up at the top has absolutely nothing to do with what was happening in the first century. That's later. But the lower part is from the first century. This was death row. This is verified from history. If you're going to be sentenced to death, this is where they put you. And that was true as early as 37 AD. And that was likely the spot where Peter and Paul was. If you go to Rome, they're probably not going to show you this, but you need to ask, this is worth going to see. And go in there and stand right where they were imprisoned.
As we think about Jesus
and Paul were here. Part of that is from a woodcut depicting the inside of this place from 225 AD. Now, when it was in Paul's time, they didn't have the staircase in the back. They just let them down through the hole that you can see in the ceiling. But that stairway was added about 180 AD, and that was in the woodcut. There is now an altar, of course, controlled by the Catholic Church. Peter's cross upside down, depicting the way he was crucified, is there on it. And we have an eyewitness that helps verify much of this from AD 95. Clement of Rome wrote about this. He said Paul was there and describes the conditions, and that he was ultimately beheaded just outside of Rome, specifically at the third milestone on the road to Ostia. Well, the milestones we can find on the same road and walk those same stones. And here's an eyewitness just a few years after the actual event specifying the spot. This is the road that leads to that spot from Rome to Ostia, and that spot has been identified. In the center are the actual stones that Paul would have been led over. And inside the building that has been built to commemorate this spot, the third, and amazingly, you go see some crazy things in Rome. Vatican, stand in line for half a day. Go to the spot out where we know Paul, as much as we can know from secular history, that where Paul actually was beheaded. There's a scene depicting that horrible event painted by someone inside that building, with the third milestone right there. Clement of Rome said it this way: weeping friends took his corpse, carried it for burial to the subterranean labyrinths, the catacombs. When I was there in the catacombs, the guide from the university said, no Christians were ever here, that's all a myth. Here's eyewitness from 95 AD, this was written. Where through the ages of oppression, the persecuted church found refuge for the living and sepulchres for the dead. And then a picture of Paul being carried for burial to the subterranean labyrinths. Nero is unfortunately well identified. Following him is Vespasian, who is the daddy of the fellow who sent Titus to destroy Jerusalem. There's both of them. Titus looks pretty brutish, doesn't he? Marched and destroyed Qumran and then on to Rome. When he went to destroy Jerusalem,
they don't care much about it. They don't respect
that happened to happen. You find prophecy of it by Moses way back in Deuteronomy, where there, if you do this, they read the law. If you do it, here are the blessings. If you don't do it, here are the curses. As a part of the curses that were there at Mount Gerizim, we look at this evening, the Lord will bring a nation from afar. This won't be Egypt. It won't be Assyria or Babylon. It'll be a nation from afar, from the ends of the earth, as the eagle swoops down, whose language you shall not understand. They probably knew Egyptian, Babylonian. They didn't know Roman language. Moses had foreseen and prophesied this destruction. Jesus likewise had in Matthew 24. Jesus came out, he said, here the temples, the beautiful buildings of the temple, do you not see these things? There will not be one stone on another that will not be thrown down. And then in verse 28, wherever the carcass is, the eagles will be gathered together. In verse 15, this is the abomination which was spoken through Daniel. Now, Daniel talked about that fourth world empire. So Daniel had spoken of it, and Moses had spoken of it, and Jesus had spoken of it, and that's what happened when Rome was destroyed. Foreseen. This wasn't God's people just losing control and being overcome. God was doing exactly what he said he was going to do. And they took out these golden vessels from the temple and carried them back to Rome and paraded them down the street and marched through this arch of Titus, the son of Vespasian. And people today by the thousands go through that arch, which is not too far from the Colosseum, never looking on the inside of it. This funny looking fellow here underneath is there to bring attention to what's there. It's a scene from the destruction of Jerusalem, prophesied by Moses. Daniel talked about it. Jesus talked about it. Then it happened in 70 AD, just exactly like he said it would happen. And you can march right by there and see it in plain view today. In spite of all of this evidence, the Dallas Morning News says, this ossuary is all there is. Additionally, we have the ossuaries of Caiaphas and his granddaughter, the son of Simon of Cyrene, the monument of Titus, of Pilate, many monuments of Herod the Great, bust of Agrippa the First, coins identified Agrippa the Second, image of Caesar on the tribute coin that he held up, monument naming Sergius Paulus, pavement naming Erastus, the city treasurer at Corinth, the theater at Ephesus, the images, temple of Diana, statues of Caesar Augustus, tombstone in Venice, Italy, identifying Caesar and Quirinius, monuments of Claudius Caesar, Nero, Vespasian, a dungeon of Peter and Paul, an execution site of Paul, the arch of Titus. That's just getting started good. This is the tip of the iceberg. And when they say the ossuary was the only evidence, that's just, we got a special word for that back in Arkansas. It's called hogwash. We need to know how to do exactly what Peter says. Be ready to give a defense. You've got in your hand the notes from this presentation, and there's a lot more than that will help you do exactly what Peter commands us to do. This is not like other religions that don't even try to defend. We are commanded to, and we can, and we need to be ready. If you're here this morning and haven't confessed your faith, that's not a reasonable position. The reasonable position is this is true, and we can defend it and show that it's true, and you need to come confessing that. We haven't talked about the evidence that Jesus is God's Son, but there is abundant evidence for it. And if you don't know, give us a chance to show you. Come confessing if you believe that Jesus is God's Son, repent of your sins, be baptized into Christ, as this book, which is verified over and over again, instructs. Won't you do that while we stand together and sing?